The Rebellion in the Cup, the story that began in Boston Harbor and changed the world. Why do Americans drink coffee instead of tea? This is not merely a matter of taste. The answer lies in Boston Harbor, 250 years ago. A protest, a crisis, and a drink transforming into a political identity. Now let us tell this story from the beginning. A company's fight for survival. Behind every great historical turning point lies an economic picture far more complex than it appears. Before 342 chests of tea sank into the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the story of that tea had actually begun in a much more distant geography in the scorched fields of India. It was hidden in a disaster unfolding silently, in cracked earth beneath a burning sun, thousands of miles away. The British East India Company, founded in 1600 by a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, was perhaps the most powerful trading company in the history of the world. It had its own army, its own fleet, its own justice system. This colossal structure was a force unto itself, more organized, more ruthless, and more effective than even sovereign states. It operated less like a trading institution and more like a crownless empire. And at the heart of that empire was tea. The tea trade was one of the company's greatest sources of revenue, and its supply chains, stretching from China to India, had run regularly and profitably for decades. And at the heart of that empire was tea. But between 1769 and 1773, a devastating famine struck Bengal, upending this balance. This was not merely an agricultural crisis, this was a systemic collapse. Fields dried up, harvests vanished. People died of hunger. Revenues from India fell. The company could no longer pay its debts. The company's coffers began to empty. Debts grew. Confidence shattered. In the warehouses of London sat a full 17 million pounds, roughly 7,700 tons of tea. An enormous fortune left unsold, unmoving, abandoned to rot. The company had come to the brink of bankruptcy. It could no longer breathe. For the British government, this was an unacceptable situation because the collapse of the East India Company would mean the collapse of Britain's entire global trade network. For the British government, this was not merely the crisis of a single company. This meant the shattering of the empire's commercial backbone. And so a question was asked in London: where do we sell this tea? The answer stood at the other end of the map: the colonies in America. It was within this atmosphere of crisis that Prime Minister Lord North and Parliament formed an idea. The colonies. There were 13 British colonies in North America, and in those colonies, annual tea consumption was approximately 1.2 million pounds. A market consuming roughly 1.2 million pounds of tea per year. A market existed, and that market looked like salvation. If those accumulated 17 million pounds of tea could be sold to the colonies, the company could be saved. On May 10, 1773, Parliament acted and passed the Tea Act. This law granted the East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the American colonies, cut out the middlemen, and gave the company special tax advantages that effectively zeroed out the duty in between. As a result, the East India Company would be able to sell tea at prices even cheaper than smugglers in the colonies. London presented this as a gift. Look, we are selling you cheaper tea. But they had forgotten that people were not only concerned with price, and it was at precisely this moment that the story began to change direction. Not taxes, but representation from the outside. Everything seemed logical. Cheaper tea, easier access, more orderly trade. But the issue was never the price of tea. In the colonies, there had been a growing unrest for years, and that unrest had a name. Being undissented, the Townshend duties of 1767 had been imposed without consulting the colonists. Decisions affecting their lives were being made thousands of miles away. They had no voice, they had no representatives, but they paid taxes. This tax was an obligation imposed upon the colonists without a single representative of theirs in Parliament. No taxation without representation. The slogan did not emerge from thin air. It was the crystallized form of rage that had been building for years. This slogan did not appear all at once. In 1770, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties. Tensions eased somewhat. Near peace had almost been achieved, but one thing was left deliberately in place: the tea tax. The tea tax did not go away. Prime Minister Lord North made no secret of why. This tax represented Parliament's right to tax the colonies, and from that principle there could be no retreat. So the issue was not money. The issue was power. And the Tea Act shattered this fragile balance entirely. Because it was not merely a matter of taxation, the law also said this: from now on, we decide who gets to do business. American merchants could no longer work with anyone outside the wholesalers designated by the East India Company in the tea trade. In other words, dozens of independent merchants in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston would be put out of business overnight. Even smugglers who had survived by contraband trade would be finished entirely. In New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, merchants swiftly made their opposition known. Tea merchants resigned from their positions or refused them outright. Arriving tea ships were turned away. But Boston was different. Things were harder. There, Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to back down. He was determined to enforce the law. And there was a further unfortunate circumstance. The majority of the designated tea merchants were either relatives or close friends of Hutchinson's. This inflamed the anger further, and then a deadlock formed. The governor refused to grant clearance to tea ships wishing to leave the harbor. A ship could not depart without paying customs duty, and with the ship unable to depart, there was no solution in sight. When the ship Dartmouth dropped anchor in Boston Harbor in November 1773, tens of thousands poured into Old South Meeting House for protest gatherings. Meetings were held and decisions were made under the leadership of Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty. It was decided that the ship would be sent back to England, but Hutchinson refused every time. By law, if the ship did not unload its cargo within 20 days, tax officials could seize the tea by force. December 16, 1773, was the final evening of that 20-day window. One night at Griffin's Wharf, on the evening of December 16, 1773, thousands once again filled Old South Meeting House. The meeting went on for hours. People had been on their feet for hours. Everyone was waiting for the answer to the same question. Will the ship return? Samuel Adams announced the word from Hutchinson. No, the governor had not changed his decision. At that moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was as if everyone felt the same thing, but no one said it aloud. Samuel Adams rose to his feet. What exactly he said is still debated, but the gravity of that moment is not. Some accounts report him saying these words: "This country can do nothing more to save itself." What Adams said precisely remains disputed. Some interpret these words as a signal given to the crowd in the meeting hall, because immediately afterward, a group of between 30 and 130 men, the number varies by source, left the meeting house and marched toward the harbor. These men needed to conceal their identities, otherwise they could be arrested by British authorities. Some had darkened their faces with coal and worn cloaks and headdresses resembling those of native people, Mohawk disguises. This disguise was not merely a practical precaution, it was also a powerful symbolic message. We are no longer the king's subjects. We are the true owners of these lands. 3 ships lay anchored at Griffin's Wharf, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. The protesters boarded the ships. The captains and crew offered no resistance. Perhaps seeing the size of the watching crowd had made them abandon any thought of it. Chests were brought up to the deck, one by one, smashed open with axes, and hurled into the sea one by one. Over 3 hours, on that cold December night, without interruption, 342 chests of tea, approximately 46 tons, worth roughly $1.7 million by today's values, were swallowed by the dark waters of Boston Harbor. In the pre-dawn darkness, the city and harbor grew quiet. But something had changed. The color of the water, the current of history. The ships were still there, but utterly empty. The water had taken on a brownish hue, and Boston awoke, having left behind the most significant night of its history. Among those who took part in the events that night, some interesting names made it into the records. Silversmith, Paul Revere, was a witness to that night. He would be immortalized in years to come by his famous midnight ride to Lexington. Journalist Benjamin Eads was among them. Thomas Melville was one of those present. It was this same Melville whose grandson would, years later, write Moby Dick. And there was Sarah Bradley Fulton, a member of the patriotic organization known as the Daughters of Liberty, who had helped prepare the Mohawk costumes for the participants. Britain's fury and the colony's awakening that night at Boston Harbor quietly set out across the Atlantic. When it reached London days later, it was no longer a story, it was a crisis. As members of Parliament read the news, they understood immediately that this was no ordinary protest. This was an open challenge, a brazen affront to the authority of the empire. to the power of the empire. And what was worse, if this challenge went unpunished, it could spread. The figures magnified the outrage. Pound 18,000 worth of tea, approximately $1.7 million in today's money. But the issue was not money. The issue was this: if Boston can do this, why can't the others? The answer came swiftly. In 1774, Parliament made a sharp move. Not one, but several laws were put into effect at the same time. The colonists gave these laws a name: the Intolerable Acts, and intolerable they truly were. Boston Harbor was closed. No ship would be permitted to enter. No cargo would be unloaded. The city was left to be economically strangled. Massachusetts's right to self-governance was curtailed. Local government was rendered nearly completely powerless. British soldiers were quartered in the homes of colonists. People, in their own homes, were neither guests nor owners. They were unwilling hosts. England's plan was clear: punish Boston, frighten the others. But one of history's most classic mistakes was repeated. Pressure did not produce fear. It produced unity. Aid came from Virginia. Supplies were sent from Connecticut. New York offered support. For the first time, the colonies truly began to look to one another, and they realized, we are not alone. In 1774, a gathering was held in Philadelphia. This was no ordinary meeting. This was the first moment the colonies thought together. The First Continental Congress. Delegates came together. And there was an ironic detail. During the meetings, there was no tea on the tables. There was coffee. Boston Harbor had been closed, but something else had been opened, a common consciousness, and that consciousness would not turn back. Tea's political death. How does a drink die? Because its taste changes. No, because its meaning changes. After the Boston Tea Party, tea was no longer just tea. It had become a symbol, the symbol of the wrong side. People began to stop drinking tea. This was not a preference. It was a stance. Boston's prominent figure, John Hancock, openly targeted those who drank tea. He described them as enemies of America. This was a grave accusation, but it was effective. Now to see tea in someone's home was not merely to see a drink. It was to see a position. Social pressure grew. Neighbors began watching one another. Who drinks what? Who prefers what? A letter John Adams wrote to his wife is one of the clearest accounts of this transformation. He is staying at someone's home. The host says to him, "We do not drink tea here. I can make you coffee." This seems a small sentence, but it is, in fact, a great rupture. Adams notes this moment and writes, "Tea must be given up. I too must give it up." And he does. This was not merely Adams's decision. It was a society's decision. By the time war began in 1775, tea had nearly disappeared entirely. It was absent from the front lines. Absent from meetings, absent from homes. What took its place? Coffee. But this transition did not happen overnight. People tried. Herbal teas, plants, alternatives. None of them stuck. In the end, a cup of coffee settled onto the table, and never left. The Green Dragon, the pulse of the revolution, on one of Boston's narrow streets, stood a building that, from the outside, looked ordinary, the Green Dragon Tavern. But this building was not ordinary. It had stood since 1697. On its ground floor, drinks were served, conversations held, commerce discussed. But the real story was being written below, in the basement. That is where the Sons of Liberty gathered. That is where plans were made. That is where decisions were taken. According to some historians, it was here, at this very spot, that the idea for the Boston Tea Party first took shape. Around a table, beside a cup. Paul Revere was a regular at this establishment. He was here before setting out on that famous night ride. The news was received here. The decision was made here. And then he set out. The Green Dragon was not called the headquarters of the revolution without reason. So what did people drink here? Everything: tea, coffee, beer. But in time, something changed. Tea was pulled from the tables. Coffee remained. This was not merely a change of beverage. This was a change of atmosphere. Tea was more formal, more distant. Coffee was more open, more equal. A carpenter and a merchant could sit at the same table. They could drink from the same cup. They could be part of the same debate. Coffee houses grew for this reason. Because people were not only looking for something to drink, they were looking for space. And coffee provided that space. Coffee was not actually new in Boston. In 1670, a woman named Dorothy Jones had obtained a license to sell coffee and chocolate. This small detail was an early sign of something great. Years later, at City Tavern in Philadelphia, people came together. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. They drank coffee. They talked. They debated. Jefferson would say, years later, coffee is the favorite drink of the civilized world. Perhaps he was not speaking merely of a drink. The drink of liberty at first. Coffee was a preference, then it became a stance, and before long, a habit. People were conscious of it at first. I am not drinking tea because I am not British. This was an explicit political position. But as time passed, this thought grew quiet. Something else came in its place. Habit. You wake up in the morning. You make coffee. You don't even think about why. This is precisely where the transformation occurs. Throughout the war years that began in 1775, tea was virtually non-existent. Not only because it was banned, because it was unwanted. Societies are remarkable. If you go long enough without doing something, you do not forget it, but you learn to live without it. Those 10 years between 1773 and 1783 reset America's memory of drink. A new generation grew up without ever seeing tea. With coffee, for this generation, coffee was not revolutionary. It was natural, and this is the most powerful form of change. When people stop choosing something and begin to simply assume it. In 1783, the war ended. No one would now be accused of drinking tea. No one would judge anyone. But no one returned to tea, because the issue was no longer politics. It was identity. It had a population of approximately 2.5 million. Then it grew rapidly. 1800, 5 million, 1,850, 23 million, 1,976 million. This was not merely population growth. It was the multiplication of habits. And at the center of those habits was coffee. In every new city, in every new home, in every new morning ritual, there was coffee. This enormous demand transformed into an opportunity somewhere else in the world. In Brazil, coffee had actually arrived in Brazil early. In 1727, but for a long time it did not matter. Then something changed. Demand. As America grew, it wanted coffee. More constantly. Cheaper. Brazil responded. Fields expanded. Forests were cleared. Land was opened to coffee cultivation. In the 1820s, 20% of the world's production came from Brazil. In the 1830s, 30%. In the 1840s, 40%. At one point, half the world's coffee came from there. This growth was not only economic, it was a social transformation. Cities grew, railways were built, ports expanded, but this story had a dark side. Slavery. Throughout the 19th century, approximately 1.5 million people were forced to labor on coffee plantations, by force. Inside a cup of coffee, there was not only aroma, there was labor, there was suffering. Brazil was not alone. Colombia, the Caribbean, Central America, all of them followed this demand. And so the event that began in 1773 transformed into a global economic upheaval. Tea, meanwhile, did not disappear. But it changed direction. It stayed in Europe. It stayed in Asia. But it lost America, and this permanently altered the balance of world trade. The perfect drink of the Industrial Revolution. America in the 19th century was already an entirely different place. Factories were rising. Cities were growing crowded. Time was accelerating. People were working longer, waking earlier, going to bed later. In this new world, there was a need to stay awake. Coffee stepped in at precisely this point. Tea contains caffeine too, but not enough. Coffee was stronger, faster, more effective, and more practical. Tea was a ritual. You waited, you watched it steep. Coffee, on the other hand, was directly results-oriented. Prepare it, drink it, move on. For a factory worker, this difference was critical. A cup of coffee quickly prepared in the dark hours of the morning determined the rest of the day. But coffee was not only energy, it was a place. Many households had no equipment. People went out, coffee houses filled. And in those coffee houses there was not only a drink, there was knowledge. Newspapers were read. Commerce was discussed. Ideas were debated. In New York, the Merchants' Coffee House was the heart of the financial world. Deals were struck there. Decisions were made there. In 1784, the foundations of the Bank of New York were laid there. This was not unique to America. In London, Lloyd's was born from a coffee house. The stock exchange took shape in a coffee house. But in America, there was a difference. Here, coffee was not only economic, it was the result of a historical rupture, not a preference, but a change of direction. And for that reason, it ran deeper. Why tea never came back when the war ended. Everyone was theoretically free. There were no taxes, no pressure, no prohibition. And at this point, a reasonable question arises. We can drink tea now. Why don't we? The answer is not simple, but it has layers. The first layer, habit. Human behavior is more mechanical than we realize. The more something is repeated, the easier it becomes. The easier it becomes, the more permanent it is. Drinking coffee had become a cycle. Morning, coffee, wakefulness, good feeling, repeat. This cycle was a structure difficult to break. The second layer, generations. The people who ended the war in 1783 were a generation that had grown up with tea, but their children were not. A new generation did not even know tea. For them, coffee was the starting point. You cannot make someone miss something they have never experienced. The third layer, identity. The war had ended, but the feelings had not. England was still the other. Tea was a reminder of England. Coffee was a reminder of something new, America. A drink had begun to behave like a flag. The fourth layer, trade. Tea still came largely through Britain. There were intermediaries. There was control. Coffee was different. It came from Latin America. It was cheaper. It was more independent. For merchants, this was not only an economic advantage, it was a strategic one. When these four layers combined, the result was inevitable. There was no longer any reason for tea to return. And sometimes, in history, the most powerful decisions are the ones that are never made. Small details, great history. We usually tell history through great names. Kings, generals, leaders. But real change most often comes from the hands of nameless people. It was the same that night of the Boston Tea Party. Among those present that night were people of very different kinds. A jeweler, a journalist, an apprentice. Some made it into history. Some were forgotten entirely. But that night, they all did the same thing. They acted. Paul Revere was there. But what made that night famous was not his presence alone. It was the shared decision of everyone who was there. A young boy was there too, Samuel Cooper, just 16 years old. Perhaps he did not fully understand what he was doing. But he never forgot that night. He went on to fight in the wars of years to come. And that night became a part of who he was. Another name, Francis Ackley, a wheelwright. The only person arrested that night. His name rarely appears in history. But he represents something, the price of a movement. Then there was Thomas Melville. He too was on those ships. Years later, his grandson was born, Herman Melville. And that grandson wrote a novel about the sea, rebellion, and human nature, Moby Dick. Perhaps the connection is not direct, but this is how history works. An event that takes place on one night lives on in the shadow of another story years later. The bridge extending to today, 250 years have passed. The world has changed. Technology has changed. People have changed. But some habits remained. Today, millions of people in America drink coffee in the morning. This is not merely a preference, it is a continuity, a legacy. According to data from the National Coffee Association of America, coffee is among the most consumed beverages in the country. It rivals water. Behind these numbers, there is not only taste, there is history. Brazil remains the world's largest coffee producer. That too is no coincidence. The demand that began in the 19th century shaped today, and the roots of that demand stretch all the way back to Boston Harbor. Did tea come back? Yes, but not with its former power. Today, tea exists in America, but not at the center. It is associated more with specific cultures, specific habits. Coffee, meanwhile, is everywhere. In cafes, in offices, in homes. Modern brands emerged. Starbucks, Dunkin', but their story, too, is connected to the same root. One night, one decision, one rebellion, and one drink. The democratization of coffee. From tin to cup by the middle of the 19th century, coffee in America was no longer a habit. It was a necessity. But there was a problem. Quality. Do not think of today's coffee. In those days, coffee was inconsistent. The coffee you drank one morning might be perfect. The next day, undrinkable. Beans were roasted irregularly. Grinding was haphazard. Brewing was based entirely on guesswork. Making coffee was not a science, it was luck. It was at precisely this point that an idea was born. Let us standardize this. In 1865, John Arbuckle stepped onto the scene. He began selling prepackaged coffee in Pittsburgh, Ariosa. This may seem like a small innovation, but it was, in fact, a revolution. People no longer had to roast the beans themselves, grind them themselves, guess at the outcome. Coffee was reliable for the first time, especially in the American West. Cowboys drank coffee at the fireside, and most of the time, that coffee was Arbuckle's. In some places, coffee inside the war in 1861, the American Civil War began. This war was not only for territory, it was also fought over habits. The Union Army gave its soldiers a daily coffee ration, approximately 2 cups. Soldiers carried their coffee with them, raw beans. During breaks, they crushed them with stones, boiled them in a tin can, drank it. That bitter, harsh coffee kept them standing. The South did not have the same fortune. There was a blockade. There was no coffee. What did they drink instead? Roasted corn, chicory, acorns. None of them was real coffee, and Southern soldiers would sometimes say, "They have coffee." The war ended, but coffee did not end. Northern soldiers returned home. What did they bring with them? A habit. What they had drunk every single day for 4 years had become a part of their lives, and that habit passed from one generation to the next. The transformation that had begun in 1773 was strengthened once again. Coffee's change of identity by the time the 20th century arrived. Coffee was no longer merely a drink. It was an industry. In 1892, Maxwell House, a coffee that began in the kitchen of a hotel, quickly became a brand. Legend has it that one day Theodore Roosevelt tasted this coffee and said, "Good to the last drop." This phrase became one of the most powerful slogans in history. Coffee was no longer merely being drunk, it was being marketed. Then wars came. World War I, American soldiers carried coffee with them as they went to Europe. The first experiments with instant coffee emerged during this period. In World War II, coffee became even more critical. Soldiers were given a daily coffee ration. Those at home bought coffee with coupons. Coffee had become a part of the war. When the war ended in 1945, America was drinking coffee. Collectively, the 1950s advertisements, families, breakfast tables, an image formed, steaming coffee, smiling people. This was a piece of the American dream. But then something changed. The third place in modern coffee in 1971, Seattle, a small shop opened. Starbucks at first it sold only beans. Then someone came along, Howard Schultz. In 1983 he traveled to Italy. There he saw espresso bars. People were drinking coffee, standing up, talking, lingering. Coffee was not merely being drunk, it was being lived. Schultz brought this to America. In 1987, he purchased Starbucks and introduced a new idea. The third place, not home, not work, but something in between. A place where people could simply be. This idea, caught on. Coffee changed again. It was no longer merely a quick drink. It was an experience, a lifestyle, and the world embraced it. Tea's quiet return, meanwhile, tea had not entirely disappeared. It waited quietly. It came back with immigrants, in Chinatown's, in Japanese tea houses. It lived on in its own space. Then one day, it met ice. 1904, St. Louis, a hot day. No one wants to drink hot tea. A merchant cools the tea, adds ice, and iced tea is born. It spreads rapidly through the American South. Sweet tea, sweet, cold, local tea had returned, but in a different form. The future, the end of coffee. Today, approximately 2.5 billion cups of coffee are consumed in the world every day. But a threat exists: climate change. Coffee is a delicate plant. If temperatures shift, if the soil changes, everything changes. Scientists say, by 2050, half of the world's suitable coffee growing areas may disappear. What does this mean? Perhaps a new change, a new drink, a new habit. History may repeat itself, but in a different form. A final word, one night, one decision, one harbor. 342 chests of tea were cast into the sea. No one thought at that moment, this will change the world's culture of drink, but it did. Today, when you drink a cup of coffee, inside that cup there is a rebellion, an economy, a history, and perhaps most importantly, the small but resolute choices that people made. Because sometimes the world changes, not with a war, but with a sip. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Every new story we make is built on your support and your ideas.